Some things get passed down from generation to generation. Stories, values, habits. And some of those things get passed down loud and clear, and some of them get passed down very quietly. And growing up, the two biggest influences I had were my mum and my dad. My mum taught me that I could be whoever I wanted to be, and my dad provided the adventure. My dad was in the military, and whenever he came home, he'd have these incredible stories about the jungles of Belize and the deserts of Iraq and the penguins of Antarctica, as well as the darker stories about the drug smugglers he'd been chasing, the wars he'd been involved with. His ship was blown up whilst he was on it during the Falklands War. He was one of the survivors off Bluff Cove. But all these stories used to absolutely fascinate me, and I used to tell all my friends at school these stories, and as it happens, I still do tell these stories. And then about 15 years ago, he got very ill. He ended up in a coma, and we were told to prepare for the worst. Now, he actually survived that incident. He was very ill. He was in hospital for a full year. But right at the beginning of it all, I came to terms with this idea. I remember thinking, okay, so he's going to die, and he's only young. He's only 60, but what an incredible life this man has had. What amazing stories. What an incredible legacy. And then I thought to myself, if I die tomorrow, what is my story? What is my legacy? What stories does Jack, my, at the time, 7-year-old, tell his friends at school about me? You know, it's not about my job. At the time, I worked in a post room for a large bank. What was he going to say, you know? Oh, he sent some more post today. Some of it was special delivery. You know? Not the sort of exciting stories that I really wanted him to be inspired by, like I was inspired by my own father's stories. As I say, I worked in this post room, and so you've probably worked out that this was not the dream career that I'd marked out for myself. I'd wanted to follow in my dad's footsteps and join the military. I spent 5 years in the military cadets. I could strip and rebuild a machine gun by the time I was about 13 years old. But when I got to that doorstep, I realized that that is not an opportunity that is available to me. Quite simply, I've got asthma, I've got epilepsy. With those two things, you cannot join the military. And it doesn't matter how far I can run or how fast I can run there, I'll never be able to join the military. And so I started to doubt my mum's advice about the fact that I could be whoever I wanted to be, because, you know, I wasn't even asking for very much. The military is a fallback job for many people, and I can't even get that. So the concept of being whoever I wanted to be seemed a little bit far-fetched. But my dad's illness made me rethink my life in absolute granular detail. And I remember thinking, well, actually, why do I want to join the military? It's not for the uniform. It's not to be screamed at by drill sergeants. It's for the adventures. And I realized I can still have those adventures. I've just got to go about them on my own terms. And once I started thinking like that, opportunities started whizzing past at a great rate of knots. A couple of weeks later, I was staggering back home from the pub at 1:30 in the morning. I think I had been celebrating the fact that it was Tuesday. I was flicking through my phone and I came across a blog about a guy called Philip Kavanagh. Now, Philip was just a regular guy from Dublin, apart from the fact that he wanted to try and row across the Pacific Ocean. Completely unsupported, from California to Hawaii, 4,000 kilometers, just in a rowing boat, no support boats or anything like that. But as part of the world's first human-powered race across that ocean. And he wanted to do it as a crew of 4, and so he's looking for a team. And there's a line in this blog that said, to join this crew, you do not need to have any rowing experience. Perfect, I thought. I've got no idea how to row a boat, and I've never been to sea before. This is clearly the adventure for me. And with that, I quickened my stagger home. I reduced the amount of hedge cuddles that I was having, and I fell through the door, and I sent off this big long email to Philip. Long story short, we became friends, we got a boat, we got a crew, and a couple of years later, we pushed off from the shores of California in our attempt to row across the Pacific Ocean. And we did all right. In a race that saw most boats that entered the race not complete it, we did okay. We came in 2nd place, we broke the pre-race world record by 19 days, and we took home 2 new records. And it was everything that I dreamt of. You know, I'd done something that I thought was impossible. I was being whoever I wanted to be. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt incredibly proud of myself. And my family were proud of me. And Jack, who is now 9, did have stories to tell. I'd reached this real pinnacle in my life. One of the things about reaching a pinnacle, though, is that when you're up there, it can look an awful lot like a cliff edge. The higher the high, the steeper the drop back down to normality. One moment you're making life or death decisions in the middle of the Pacific, the next you are back in the post stream being told off because you've borrowed a stapler without filling out the right form. And that's the thing about life-changing moments. Your life has to change. Because if it doesn't, if everything stays the same, then the contrast between who you were and who you've become can be devastating. And everything started to fall flat. My mental health declined, my drinking increased, perhaps to cope with that, and I realised quite quickly that I needed a new pinnacle to aim for, a higher pinnacle to aim for. The problem that I had was that I couldn't really find anything that beat this, and it's completely subjective. You know, there's lots of wonderful adventures to have all over the world, but for me personally at that time, nothing really beat being 1,000 miles from any piece of land in 10,000 foot deep water, way out of the range of any kind of helicopter rescue, just entirely alone. And so I returned to the world of ocean rowing. What was a bigger challenge in ocean rowing? And again, it's subjective, but for me, out of the Pacific, the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans, the hardest ocean to row across is the Indian Ocean. And so that became the new focus. It was a real challenge to do it. There was no race across this ocean. Very few people had attempted it at the time. Most of them had failed. But we got a boat, we got a crew, and a couple of years later, we pushed off from the shores of Western Australia in our attempt to row across the Indian Ocean. And it was orders of magnitude more challenging than the Pacific Ocean. The waves were phenomenal, the storms were incredible. You can see in this video that we're wearing full wet weather gear, but it's not raining, it's just that the ocean wants to be inside the boat more than it wanted to be outside of the boat. I had some of the darkest times of my life out here on this ocean. But in contrast, we'd have these incredible moments where these amazing creatures would come up and see us, and they'd swirl around the boat and swim under the boat and almost gently nudge the boat. And when you've got this enormous, great, prehistoric-looking creature lying alongside of your tiny little rowing boat, and it's staring at you with this giant whale eye, it feels like you're looking into this creature's soul. The happiness is so extreme. But then again, the darkness was so extreme. It's just a very extreme place to operate in at both ends of the spectrum. But eventually, after just over 70 days of rowing 24/7, we'd made land. We'd reached Mauritius. We'd rowed across the Pacific Ocean. I'd achieved this new huge thing. I'd climbed this new pinnacle. And once again, I felt incredibly proud of myself. But once again, I returned to normality. Once again, I returned to work. And once again, everything started to fall apart. And what I hadn't worked out at this stage was that I was coping with these huge lows I was experiencing post-adventure by, in effect, chasing the dragon. You know, constantly looking for that next big hit of identity, of adrenaline, of meaning. And of course, the problem with chasing a dragon is that it's a mythical beast, and so you can never, ever catch it. And in fact, the higher you jump to try and grab one, the greater the come down on the other side when you are inevitably unsuccessful. Everything started to fall apart in my life. My mental health crashed to its lowest point ever. My drinking increased to its highest point ever. I was drinking to cope with normality. I was drinking to cope with work. I was smiling too much. I was pretending too much. And eventually it all came to a head. I decided to end my life by jumping off the Ponkasukti aqueduct near my house in Wrexham. I got up that morning, I put on my suit, I made my sandwiches for work, I got my work bag, I got in my car, and I had a decision to make. Go to work and repeat what felt like an endless and pointless cycle, or go to the bridge and finally make all of this noise stop. I chose the bridge, but the act of making that decision made me burst into tears. I came back inside the house and I shared with I admitted to my long-suffering but wonderful partner Emma my mental health secrets. And she was brilliant. She made sure that I didn't go to work until I called a doctor. The doctors were great. They signed me off work. They gave me all this mental health support, and there was a real glimmer of hope. But I carried on drinking, and I knew that drinking was bad for me. I knew that I had a problem with drinking at this stage, but I also knew that I was going through something incredibly dark, and the concept of trying to get sober in the middle of all that just seemed to be too overwhelming to deal with. And of course, the problem with that was that despite having all this support, my mind wasn't really healing. And also, life isn't a fairy tale. and it tends to pile on when it's least invited to do so. And so just a few days after I got all this support and there was this glimmer of hope, a friend of mine sadly killed himself, and then a couple of weeks later, another friend drowned. And those are dark things to deal with at the best of times, but they are just life things. But in the situation that I was already in, I found it very, very difficult to deal with it all, and I started to spiral. And then a couple of months later, an hour before my 40th birthday, my dad died of his own alcoholism. My dad was a brilliant man. He was someone that I looked up to all my life. He gave me adventure. He gave me strength that I did not know that I had. But some things are passed down from generation to generation without ever being spoken aloud. And he had been coping with his alcoholism, perhaps as a way of dealing with normality after his adventurous lifestyle, I'm not sure. And I imagine for much of his life, and so had I, but neither of us had ever spoken aloud about it. And the reason that I was following in his footsteps in this way may have been a little bit genetic, but I think for the most part this was simply just a matter of me watching how this man lived and then managing how this man managed. And so watching him die should have been this incredible wake-up call, this sort of instant sobriety. It turns out that sobriety doesn't normally work like that, and it took another 6 months of wrestling with that one before I was able to get on top. 28th of March 2021 was the day that I got sober, and I've been sober ever since. Now, I'm going to be really clear here. The point of this talk is not to tell you not to go for your dreams. I'm not here to say, don't go big. In fact, I hope that you do. Go and do the big, wild, impossible, terrifying, but wonderful thing that you harbour. Because the excitement you experience in chasing your dream may well be the most wonderful thing that you do with your life. And it is there for the taking. Most people can do most things. Certainly ocean rowing. If I can row an ocean, then anyone can row an ocean. But if you need more evidence than that, then a friend of mine who's sadly no longer with us, but a lady called Angela Madsen, she rowed all the way around the UK. She also rowed across 4 oceans. So few people have done anything even close to that with their lives, yet she was paralysed from the waist down throughout all of that. So absolutely, most people could row an ocean tomorrow. Most people could run their marathon or write their book or change their career or start their business. It's there for the taking, and I hope that you do it. But I imagine that most of us watched enough motivational videos on YouTube to already know this. We already know that we can be whoever we want to be. We already know that we can reach for the stars and we can succeed. The big learning that I got then from living through all this was not the limits of human endurance, was not the pride, and it wasn't even the stories, which is why I did it in the first place. It was purpose. And I realised that without purpose, for me anyway, and I imagine many others, without purpose, there isn't anything, nothing is sustainable. Not your goals, not your job, not even your happiness. And you can achieve these brilliant, amazing things, these huge pinnacle events that outweigh anything you thought you could do in your life. And there can be real purpose in those pinnacle events. But when there's no purpose or why or meaning in the day-to-day, then none of it will really stick. All of a sudden, you'll constantly be looking for that next big pinnacle. It's got to be bigger and louder and faster until eventually you burn out. But once purpose is present, everything changes slightly. All of a sudden, it's not about the size of the thing anymore. It could be global or local, massive or quiet. When purpose is present, the work means something, and meaning makes it sustainable. And so once I worked all this out, I quit my job. And to be clear, my job was fine. The people that I worked with were lovely. The people that I worked for were fantastic. They let me go splashing about in the sea several times. They were fantastic. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that I transformed so dramatically in the process of achieving my dreams that I no longer found enough purpose or meaning in the work that I was doing. And so I set up my own business. I now work with ocean rowers and extreme adventurers. I didn't do that because it gave me more money or more time off or more benefits. I did that because it gave me purpose, and solely because it gave me purpose, no other reason. And by doing that, it led to some happiness, and by doing that, it allowed me the energy to invest in my family, and seeing them happy and successful gives me more purpose. And so achieving your dreams is incredible, but pinning your identity to those achievements in isolation is where the problem can often lie. The highs are amazing, but you cannot live on a mountaintop. Life doesn't exist in those extremes. Life exists on the in-between. And so it is not the peaks that define us, but how we carry ourselves between those peaks. That is where purpose lives. And so purpose is not this big dramatic quest, but just a quiet decision to show up differently. Not for the applause, not for the awards, but because you've decided what matters to you. And you're going to live like it matters. And so I used to think that legacy was about having this big story to pass on. But I've realised that it's not just stories that we pass down. It's the way in which we live that gives other people permission to live differently. And so you can have your big adventure and row your ocean and climb your mountain and write your book and change your career or whatever wonderful thing you want to do, and I hope that you do it. But always remember that somebody in your life is watching how you live, and you get to choose what they see. Thank you.